Now I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. Because of my chains, most of the brothers in the Lord have been encouraged to speak the word of God more courageously and fearlessly.
Now, when is the last time that something went terribly awry and we immediately thought, this is all for the advance of the gospel? Probably not. In fact, we'd more likely say that when things are going our way, that is when the advance of the gospel is actually happening. But that tends to be an issue between how we look at what God is doing versus the plans that we have created. Now, here in Philippians 1:12-14, we learn of the term palace guards. Now, the palace guard was an exclusive unit of soldiers reserved for the Emperor of Rome. Their detail was to handle all of the emperor's security affairs, including overseeing any of the prisoners that were of the emperor. Now, it's widely viewed that this type of imprisonment would not actually see Paul ended up in a prison cell, but actually chained to the palace guard, possibly living from a home. Now, knowing Paul, you can almost see the humor in this scenario. Paul would actually look at this predicament as the best possible outcome. This isn't a detour. In fact, if anything, this is the perfect scenario that he gets to have. So instead of being resentful, Paul is actually joyful. What may have been considered as a punishment for being a follower of Jesus was now actually a blessing, not just to Paul, but to these guards. Not only did they get to hear the good news of Jesus, but they also got to experience him through the way that Paul lived throughout these circumstances. Think of this for a second. What do you suppose those chains were like between those two? Were they taut, a burden to the guard? Or could you imagine them filled with slack? See, I imagine that Paul wasn't a burden to these guards. In fact, probably expressed personal care for their well-being. Paul saw this restriction, which was allowed by God, to be a focused mission, to be exclusively narrowed in on these guards and their families, that the gospel was reaching specifically these people, and that Paul would bring witness to how important Christ was over his personal freedom. So imagine the joy behind sending this letter to the church of Philippi to share about how God was using this imprisonment to further his kingdom. This is the avenue that God's gospel takes us. Not only is it there for the guards, but it's there for any believer that needs to hear that when we have assurance in Jesus and his power, we are free. Part of the process of starting this church has actually gone through many trials and turmoil for my wife and I. It actually started with feeling called to sell our house, letting go of things that brought us comfort, but actually led us to go deeper and more dependent on Jesus, that had us ending up seeing something that we could never see before. See, we believe that God is leading us to where he wants us, and part of that process is simply us resting on that assurance, and in that gives us freedom regardless of the circumstances. And walking like this not only can bear witness to someone else, but it can actually be the catapult that gets them started and activated into their own relationship. I think God has great intention behind that.